Just a few years ago, one evening, I was on 8th Street with a friend of mine, dining in a bar and a restaurant, and talking about a whole host of issues, politics, and so forth. And we started talking about the American system of administration, capitalism, and rugged individualism. My companion that evening told me that the notion of capitalism in this system is really destroying the deaf community and is harmful to the deaf community. I was more than a little shocked by this and asked him why. And he said, think for a moment of infinity. Think of an infinite loop. Deaf people must have this infinite connection and interconnection with each other. We require eye gaze for conversation. So this same notion of individualism doesn't fly as well. So there's also the fact that two hearing people need not observe each other to communicate, and deaf people do. And hearing people hear their own voice. That supports this notion of individualism. So if we look at how this evolution has taken place and what it bodes for our future, we have to examine capitalism and its effect on our community. So how then do we, as a deaf community, ensure that we persist? How do we evolve and survive in this changing world? What are our options in this rapidly changing world? What is our role? How do we remain relevant? How do we stay connected and interconnected without losing ourselves? Well, there are two different paths that we could take at this juncture. You know, the book Islay fancies the notion of an island of deaf people. And that is actually dystopian. Dystopian capitalism is something that we could escape from in this Islay notion, but that also separates us from the larger ecosystem, though it shields us from the capitalist dangers. But we are, as a community, somewhat akin to an organism. In order to survive, we have to find our niche. We have to have the energy and spirit of our community collectively together. If we are distinct and separate but isolated, then no one cares. No one notices in the larger ecology. As part of society, I have to ask how we as a community can persist, grow stronger, both economically, socially, culturally, and so forth. What value do we have to offer the world? And what then does the world have to offer us? And beyond that, what does that model look like? How do we see this synthesis? How do we plan and prepare to have this kind of interconnectedness? So, in musing over these problems, one thing that occurs to me, based on my own upbringing, is called to mind in this map that you see. If you look at this map of Toronto, and in fact, how fortuitous, we just had a mention of Toronto a moment ago in the other presentation. But if you look at Toronto, we generally think of it as a single city. But within that city, there are a number of different ethnic enclaves. There is an Asian enclave, a Jewish enclave, and so forth, all within this one city. So each of these enclaves has its own identity, its own collective spirit, its own language, its own culture, its own businesses, in fact. And you see these all existing within the larger city. They're all part of the city as a whole. So the ability to have the distinct enclave and community and still be part of the larger community is one that I find interesting, because the Toronto Museum of Deaf Culture has now been established there and is a nexus of drawing visitors to that area. So going from isolation to attraction of the larger society, we see that museum being a centerpiece. How can we be a part of that and part of the success as a whole of the community and its enclave. We see enclaves in New York City where there's Little Italy, Chinatown, Miami has Little Havana, and Virginia has the American Saigon area. And you'll notice their street signs, their business signs are in their own native language. This is important because it's a way of plugging into the power of the structure as a whole for the city, the economic structures. So you could have a council member that represents your community, which gives you greater voice for your community. But I've talked now so far about cities. But how then can we see that same sort of idea occur in other areas? The deaf community is not a large one. It's a very small community. So outside of urban areas, what are the possibilities for such connections? This example that you see on the screen is Little Kabul. It's in Fremont, California, right near the California School for the Deaf of Fremont. Not that large of a city. It's small, in fact. But even in such a small place, they have ethnic enclaves. And we see this really around the world. So can that model be successful anywhere? We have to wonder, though, where we are and how do we push for a deaf enclave in rural areas? Where do they exist? And how then can we invest our time and resources to create and sustain these enclaves? So the selection of a place for an enclave actually involves a number of things. The deaf community's strength is that it is very closely tied to its educational institution. The workplaces in areas surrounding the deaf schools have created many economies that are already existent and could then be strengthened. In Fremont, we see this to be true in Riverside, in St. Augustine, in Austin, Texas, in Indianapolis, Indiana, in Frederick, Maryland. We see examples of this. And there are already existing enclaves in these areas, Rochester, New York, and here in Washington, D.C. Gallaudet University is really the heart and center for the surrounding enclave. So these educational institutions can help to create what we might call a deaf ethnic enclave. So the promised land is out there. How do we get there? How do we get to that ethnic enclave? It can't merely be set up randomly. How do we then create it? How do we get support for the creation and sustenance of that enclave? If it only involves deaf people, that's fine, but how do we create these interconnections to find a way to build our economies, our social and cultural institutions? So how do we map onto the grid? One example of this that's called to mind is crowdsourcing, which is all the rage right now. So the way crowdsourcing works is that with a crowdsourcing site, you would then define how you're going to connect with others, what different ideas you bring to the table. And you connect those ideas to people with the money to invest in them. One example that exists here in DC is Fundrise. Fundrise is a website that's quite interesting. The owner of that company searches out capital funds for development and redevelopment. He buys buildings. Now, the old model would be that you would look for a particular investor, and then once you find them and have enough capital to invest, then the people with the most money that invested would have the most power to define the development and use of that. And so they lead the decisions on a day-to-day basis. But Fundrise's model is quite different. They have a building, they post the building information about it, its sale price, other conditions, and so they offer that building to be bought by everyone from investments of $100 to $100,000. So there are many, many owners of that building. That then helps to be sure that we are connecting to these other groups and that we remove barriers that exist to connecting to those with the capital to invest. So we have local people who buy into that particular building. They then have a vested interest in the success of that building. They're connected to it and they are business owners, if you will. So the crowdsourcing concept could be one that we use to attract more people with the capital to invest in deaf community enclaves and ventures. Deaf community businesses could be investing in these. That's one particular model. Another is ways to promote our ideas so that it gets to those who could invest in supporting them. Forbes magazine has said that crowdsourcing is going to be the hottest thing over the next few years. It's predicted to be a wonderful tool. So then how can we use that technology to our advantage to overcome barriers? There was one book written called The End of Big that I'd like to refer to. That book actually predicts that we will then be returning to our roots, the roots of local economies, of local craftsmen. In days past, when you went to go shop for your needs, those commodities were built and made in your local economy, in your local environment. The age of industrialization and mass production took hold and spread, and it has dehumanized, depersonalized a great many things and created vast separation between people and the people that make their commodities. So if we look at sustainability movements, local food movements, we see them really exploding, and there are a lot of markets there that could be tapped into by deaf people. And to tap into that kind of investment so that we are supporting the enclaves by people buying into our ideas and cultures and ventures. So very often I have dreamed that if we were able to establish such enclaves, I think about the kind of community we have here with Gallaudet's real estate holdings on 6th Street, the vibrant change on 8th Street, where at Union Market and 8th Street you can go anywhere and find people that sign to some extent. This brings to mind the Martha's Vineyard model. It's often known that Martha's Vineyard had people who signed all over the community, yet only 5% of the people there were deaf. So it only takes a small number of people. You need a sufficient critical mass that's quite small to create this lifestyle. How then do we create that kind of access and that opportunity for deaf people where more people are signing and greater access is to be enjoyed? We can do that by, as I mentioned before, having deaf people enter into politics, not necessarily president, but delegate in your town council. So your enclave is then represented in the larger community, creates greater voice for your community. Deaf professionals who are signing in different environments, such as medical professions, legal, and so forth, that creates the community wherein we can feel at home, even within the larger scope of home of the city and the larger realm. We can do this by collaboration, by working with other deaf organizations, and thinking ahead, planning proactively will lead us to success. With that, I thank you.